Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our NITRO Workflows webinar today. We're going to be talking about some of the things you can do with workflows. We're going to be talking about some of the differences between workflows and custom actions. But before we get into all that, I just want to give you a quick introduction. I know we're still waiting for a few folks to join. I know we just hit the 2 o'clock hour, so we're going to do a little bit of introductory stuff, and then hopefully a few more folks will join before we get into the meat of the webinar. So a few things. I'm James Restivo. I work for Crow Canyon Software. I've been at the company for about 7 years. The company's been around for about 20 years. We also have on the call Scott Restivo, who will be there to answer any questions you guys might have during the course of the webinar. So there is a questions box. If you look at the GoToWebinar screen, you should see a questions option. You just type in any questions into that box. We'll get them answered either during the course of the webinar today, or we'll follow up with an answer afterwards if we can't get to it today. This session is also being recorded, so we will go ahead and share it with you afterwards, and we'll also be able to share it with anyone who was not able to attend today. So again, appreciate your time coming on to this webinar to learn a little bit more about NITRO Workflows and what the possibilities are with this tool. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like we're give people a couple more minutes to get logged in, and so it looks like we're pretty much ready to go. So I want to start out here. You can see my screen. It is the NITRO Workflows interface. So this is the interface to start creating your workflows. And there's a few things on here I kind of want to walk through and talk about before we get into the actual creation of workflow. Maybe a few things you might not have been aware of. There's been a few updates, a few new things we've released fairly recently in the last few months that you might not be aware of. So I want to make sure we point those out and make sure you have everything you need. So we're going to be coming at it just so you're aware of where we're working from. This is one of our demo sites. This is our IT Premium Modern site. That's one of our out-of-the-box applications. It already has a few workflows configured, as you can see. So we can use those to kind of see what it looks like when we configure one of these workflows. It's also just a good tool to use in case we want to run a workflow or do a demo of a workflow. We have that already here, or we can just trigger it from the site as well. So the few things here. So on the screen, you'll see what site you're working in. So right at the top, you'll have your different sites. We have a bunch of different sites in our demo environment. So we're picking this one ITP Modern site to work from. And you'll notice for each of these workflows, once you've got them created, there's a few options over here on the right-hand side. So these actions are for editing the workflow, deleting the workflow, and then there's this execution logs where you can see how, when it was run, what issues it might have run into. If we click that, you can put in a time frame for when the execution might have happened and see any errors that might have occurred for those event types. So we can, it's going to populate our site, it's going to populate our list, and then we can choose the event type for which the workflow could be run on. And then we can do a list item ID, and we can look back however many days we want to look back. So if we look back 5 days on this send mails workflow, you'll see if there's any things here. You can see that there's ones with the status of success. Of course, we also sort them and see if there's any that have failure, any kind of a different status, but it looks like they're all succeeded. And so that's a good way to get it. And then you can export, you view the details, take this information, export it out to, copy and paste it, export it out to us if you wanted to. But that's a really cool tool to just go in there and see how your workflow is working, and if there's any problems with it, you can see where that problem might have cropped up. The other really great thing here is this export workflow settings, where you can take the settings of this workflow and save them to a file. So when I click this, it's going to pop open a little download option at the bottom. You'll see it ask me what I want to do with it. We can save it. We can save it as something in one of our folders somewhere, and do save as in a folder, and just it's going to be a text document with the settings file for this. For that workflow. And that allows you to come in later, and when you create a new workflow on the same type of list, or on a actually on any list, but as long as it has the same kind of parameters, the same schema, you could actually import that same workflow onto a new list. And that's a great way to have a parity between a dev environment and a production environment. go and create your workflow on the dev. Make sure your list template on dev matches what your list template's going to be in prod. And as long as you've got that all synced up, you can export your workflow from dev, port it over to prod, and it should work just as is. And the other neat thing here is that you can see who created the workflow. This was created by our app, so we don't have it created by, but you can see when it was created, when it was last modified, and get those execution details, get those details of when it was added and who built it. So, all right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the new workflow options. So it's going to pop open the screen here for creating the workflow. You give it some kind of name at the top. You want to make sure the name is descriptive. You want to make sure it's something that's easily referenceable, something that explains what it's for. Something fairly explicit, so it's not just a generic create item workflow name. What does that mean, create item? Well, you got to go in and dig into it and find out. But if you have the workflow name explicitly outlined up here, that gives you really good indication as to what it's actually doing. That's going to be helpful in the long run when you're looking through your list of workflows. You'll be able to understand what it's doing fairly quickly. Now we're coming at this from the site perspective. So the site is pre-selected, and then we can choose our list. So we could do a workflow on any one of the lists in our site. We can do something, let's go ahead and do something on the tickets list. Now, once we select the list, you'll see you have this option down here to import the workflow settings. So going back to what I was describing about the export workflow, you can export it out, and then you can use this feature to hit the browse button and then upload it into the site, and then it'll carry over all the settings from that workflow you created and possibly in dev and brought over to prod. But then there's some options here for when does this workflow get triggered. So this workflow is being triggered from an action that's happening on the SharePoint list, right? So you're coming at this from a perspective of an item gets added, trigger this workflow. That's where this item is created option comes into play. When something is modified on a list, go ahead and send out a workflow or trigger a workflow. It could do it when the item is deleted as well. So if you want to get a notification anytime someone deletes a record or deletes a document, you can make sure you have a notification or send mail action as part of that workflow, and you just say the when to start it is when the item is deleted. But we could also base it on date time field in the item itself. So that's really useful for SLAs or follow-up or service level agreements and overdue notifications. Things like that. So in our tickets list, we have a due date. A lot of the task lists in SharePoint have due dates as well. And what you'll do is select your, based on date time field, which is due date. You can have this workflow run. It could be before or after the time in that date field. So let's say this one we're going to do 2 days, and we're actually going to set it 2 days before. So you see, you can put any number in here. And then you have references to any of these time values of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, or even years. And then you can run the workflow either before or after that date. So you could even run something up to a year before a date in the field. So like an auto renewal for a contract, you might want to send out a notification a year before that date comes up, or more likely within 6 months or 3 months. So you could do that like 3 months before, something like that. And then you could also repeat that every so often. And then you also have the options. So, so that's on the base date time field. But then beyond that, you also have options for the scheduled workflow. And we'll dig into this a little bit more. We have a scheduled query workflow I want to use as an example here. We'll talk about that later. But for now, just note that you can have the scheduled workflow that will allow it to go off every so often. That could be a daily report, for instance. As part of the workflows, and when we get into the mail templates as part of the send mail action, I'll show you that you can embed views of lists, and you can also embed reports of lists in a send mail action. And that can be part of the scheduled trigger, the scheduled workflow. Every day, every month, every 3 months, whatever it might be, you can have that scheduled workflow. But then you also notice there's this user triggered option. This comes into play when we're using our custom actions. So we also have a tool over here called custom actions. I'll talk about that piece of it as well. But essentially the custom actions piece can be used in conjunction with the workflow piece. And that can, you can trigger a workflow from this, one of these NITRO workflows from a custom action. And I'll talk about that, how that works. Then you also have directly a scheduled report option where you could, kind of similar to the scheduled query, but this is looking for a CAML query here where we're getting certain items out of the list based on certain criteria, and then doing some action with them. The scheduled report is more specifically, I'd use that as my example, where you could have a report go out every so often, every month, every week, every day. And you can see there's some notes here that you have to configure that in the send mail action. Then the other thing here is that you have these this trigger time, and this is especially with the scheduled workflow, because we don't know when this is going to get kicked off. It could be the first day of a month, but that could be during a holiday, especially obviously January 1st. So you maybe don't want to trigger that workflow. You don't want to send something out or do anything until you hit the business hours. So you could always trigger it based on that time that's configured up here. You could set it so it only does it during business hours and days, or you can set it so it only does it during non-business hours days. Now the question always comes up, what do we mean by business hours and days? Where do we set that? Where do we configure that? That's coming from your site settings on the SharePoint site where this program is set up. So you would look back at your site settings, and within that you can determine what your weeks of the day are, days of the week, I should say. You'll determine your days of the week, and you'll determine your business hours, and it's going to use that information to determine whether or not to trigger this workflow. Then you also have options here for the trigger options for running the process when it is, let's say you have a workflow or a custom action that adds an item to a list, and you're creating an item is created workflow, and you turn this as on. You just really want to be careful with that. Just, there are valid use cases, there are valid reasons why you'd want to do this, but just, as the note says here, you just want to be careful about creating an infinite workflow. So if something gets created here, then we update or create an item on another list, but maybe there's, it could be the same list, and then we just end up in this infinite loop where we're creating an item on this list, and we're triggering this because it's an item created workflow, and then it just goes around and around, infinite loop. So that's one thing you want to be careful of, but there are definitely cases where you'll want to use this trigger option for your workflow. So all throughout the application, all throughout the actions, and when we get into custom actions as well, you'll see this condition builder. And I want to talk about that in some detail because it is a really useful way to determine when to trigger that workflow. So we have these options up here, but those are going to be global options as far as saying when an item is created, trigger this workflow. That's going to be when any item is created on that list, right? But you want to trigger this workflow, for instance, only when certain criteria are met on that ticket, only when it's a certain category of ticket, perhaps, only when it's a certain status of an item, only when it's for a certain department, maybe you want to trigger this workflow. That's where the conditions come into play, and that's where you can really granularly define when to run this workflow. So you can say, you can use our category example, and we'll say, category equals hardware request is one of our categories in our IT site. So we can say that the category equals hardware request, then and only then do we want to run this workflow. We can also add groupings here where we can use the and or conditions and build out some complex condition builders where it's going to be looking to whether these all evaluate as true or all evaluate as false. And so you just have to be careful, or you just have to understand how the ors and the ands are going to play together and work together to build out that condition. And of course, you can always delete them out if you don't want that condition. And then we get into the actions. So, there's a whole bunch of actions here. You're probably familiar with some of these already, but they're pretty common actions that you'll want to run on your system. So add list item. add list item is going to be one that comes into play when you're adding an item for like creating a subtask for a parent item, or maybe you're using it as kind of like a project management site. So you create the project, we'll have our, point to like a projects list up here when the item is created, and then we can maybe set some criteria on it. We'll do an add list item, and that could be in a different list. So it doesn't have to be on the same list, it's going to be on a different list. And again, you'll see that there's this condition builder here. So you could, this could allow you to do some branching. So let's say you want to do this add list item only when, going back to maybe category, we'll do when category equals hardware problem. Then and only then will we want to run this action. So we give it some action name, create task for hardware problem. And then we're going to do it on current item. We'll talk about query list and variables in some detail in just a moment, but for now we'll run it on the current item. And we'll have a target site, which will be the same site as we're in, which is this ITP modern site. And we'll send it to a associated task list, which just gives us a moment to populate those lists within the site. And then we're going to target this associated task list. And then here you get the column mapping, so you can pre-populate or determine what goes into that item once it gets created. So column mapping could be, assigned to could be the same as the assigned staff on the ticket. So you just do simple mapping like that. We could do, due date is the same as the due date on the ticket, but maybe with something added to it or subtracted from it. So you can use some of these calculations here. So you can say, when do time span, the time span hours are always, and this is important to know, the time span hours are always like zero, four values, 4 placeholders here. And we're doing seconds at the, was it minutes, seconds, minutes, hours? No, it's got to be, day. Well, business days is the first one. Hours, minutes, seconds. Okay. So it's business days, business hours, seconds, minutes, and then seconds. And we'll put our due date in there as a placeholder. And we can say, okay, let's say 2 hours. So we're going to subtract 2 hours from the due date on the ticket and say that this task that we're creating is going to be due 2 hours prior to that due date on the ticket. So you can do things like that with these functions to make sure that the right value is going into that subtask. Let's see, there's other things like that. We could do a task name as, and we could also do free form text in here as to say, task name is going to be investigate the issue. Right, so we can do something like that where we just have a free form text in there. So it doesn't have to be a reference, it doesn't have to have a placeholder. So things like that. I mean, so that's, and then once you're done, you just save it and then you're good to go. So once it's, we see that these conditions are met, we're going to run this action and it's going to create this item in the associated task list with these parameters already pre-selected for it. So actually, let me go ahead and save that. And then another thing we can do is we can add another list item. And we do, create subtask. And we'll do a different condition where we say maybe category equals hardware request. So it's going to be different from a hardware problem. It's a hardware request, and we're going to create a task. I won't belabor it too much, but you can create a task that is different than what's going to be created for a hardware problem. So that in that sense, you can branch out and have different things happen based on different criteria in your conditions for each of these actions. Let's say that's just going to create it. So let's do one. Let's just do one mapping here. Provision. There we go. Let's see that. So you got two things here. One's going to be for a hardware problem. One's going to be for a hardware request. So it's going to branch out like that. And then, you know, as we go and build out these different flows, I mean, we could do another update list item and things like that. We can actually change the order here, where we can, you know, if we want something to happen prior to another action, or we you know, we realize, oh, we have to add this other action into the workflow and we forgot to do it, it'll by default add it to the bottom, and you just change the order and put it where you want it to be. So we can flip these around pretty quickly, like that. So the other option here, so we have the add list item, now we have update items. So again, you can do this condition builder here, where you can say, you know, based on this criteria, run this particular action, give it some action name, where we're going to say, I don't know, update tasks. And we're going to do we do it for the current list. And then we do our placeholders here. So we say, you know, it's going to be updating the current item, right? So this is going to be updating that current ticket or current SharePoint list item. But typically you're going to want to maybe update a lookup item where you have that related, you know, some related list. So you can do that. You can update something in the category list, issue type list. And these are all lookups on this main parent list that we're working from. And so we can go and reference any of them and actually create, you know, do an update on those items. And then this query list comes into play. I'll show you how to set up that query list variable. There's a, you could go and actually query, let's say you want to update the task, you can go and query all the tasks related to this particular item and then use this query list action. So let me go ahead and do that real quick, because we can do a query list here. Again, you can put some conditions around it, so we can get, you know, get all. Usually like to do QL just so we know what it's doing. QL get all tasks. And this is going to be item. This could be an item or an item collection. So when using a query list, you can get just a single value, or you can get a whole collection of values and take some action on it. So in this case, we want to get the item collection of all tasks. We're going to get them from this ITP modern site. We're going to get them from the associated task list. Let's give this a moment to come up. And you see you have some options here for how to query that. You could go out, you know, to the query option here and build a CAML query. That's always an option if you're familiar with how to do those. But more simply, you have this lookup column, where on this on the associated task list, we already have a lookup column pointing back to this the main tickets list. And from there, we can just select that in the lookup column here. So if we do lookup column, there should be a related ticket column. Let's see, I'm not coming up there. Maybe it's related items. Yeah, here we go. Lookup columns related ticket ID. Not sure why it wasn't coming up there, but you can do it from here. So you can get related items, say lookup column, related ticket ID, list view is all tasks, and then so you can limit, you know, which ones are coming up. You can say, oh, only take this action on all the completed tasks that have this ticket ID on it, or only the ones that are overdue, or only the ones that are open. In this case, we're just going to do it on all of them. Then we're going to continue the execution when only if items are found, which means if it doesn't find anything, it's going to just stop the process. It could also continue on. We could do a query list. In this sense, we might want to be looking for any open tasks. So maybe the workflow, kind of quick example there, the workflow could be to close the parent ticket, but first you want to do a check to make sure that all the tasks are closed. Right, so you want to make sure, like a project, maybe for instance, you want to mark a project as complete, but you want to make sure all the attendant tasks for that project are also completed. So in this case, in that that scenario, what you want to do is if there's any items found, let's say in this open tasks, you can see, okay, we're looking at our sub list, we're looking at this list view of open tasks, and if we find any items, this is going to stop the process. Right? So if it finds any open tasks, it'll stop you from being able to close the ticket using that workflow. But we could do it, in the other reverse case, only if items are found. So if we could do, if any task is completed, then it'll continue the process, or we can just do it. You can always do it. And one thing I kind of glossed over here, I haven't mentioned, this delay execution. This kind of is there throughout the process, really to help prevent your workflows from going on top of each other, from preventing each other from going off. So you might want, if you have too many workflows happening at the same time, it can cause conflicts and it can cause problems for that workflow actually working. So if you have multiple workflows on item creation on the same list, you're going to potentially run into conflicts, potentially run into save conflicts, save issues. You might be expecting certain things to appear in a template that don't appear because now the ticket's been updated and those criteria, or that criteria, is not met anymore. So you just want to be careful about when you run these and what order these things are being executed in. So that's why I put this delay execution, so you can kind of make sure that one thing's happening after another. You're not doing it all at once. It helps to keep it all smooth. Okay, and then so that was a query list. Oh shoot, did I just delete that? Yeah, I just deleted that, didn't I? Let me save this query list real quick. I'll get all tasks. All right, so we're going to be checking to see if any of these tasks are still open. All right, so associated tasks, we do our related items. Sometimes it takes a little time to get it going. That's okay. We'll just, once we get that going, we'll hit related items and we'll go ahead and save this. All right, there we go. Related items, we'll do all tasks, and we'll do okay. So we got that query list. So the reason you might want to maybe want to move this up, because obviously you want to do this query list before you do another action, right? So you could if you had an update list item action, you might want to move this above it, because the thing we're going to do next here, if we do an update list item action, put some conditions around it, but we don't need the conditions because the query is actually going to provide the conditions for us. So this could be closed ticket, right? So this time we're going to be working on the current. Was it closed? We're going to do closed tasks. And we're going to be taking that task status and marking it as closed, right? So what this will do, if you have query, you're getting all the tasks related to a particular ticket. In this case, what we can do is mark them all as closed. Let's say you want the kind of converse scenario to what I was talking about, where you would make sure prevent the closure of an item before all the tasks are closed. This is kind of the reverse scenario where you might want to close all the subtasks when the parent item is closed. So that could be, in the use case I can think of, we have in our IT help desk this problems module, where if you take the problem and close it, it'll close all the related tickets to that problem. So you can kind of keep everything at the same status. You don't have anything orphaned with a different status. So it gives you a way to manage that process. There's also an option here for deleting list items. And this one's pretty straightforward. You can see how you can use that query list option to go and get items to be deleted. So there's another way you could use that query list. But you could also say, I'm just going to delete the current item, or going to delete a lookup item in another list. And it's going to give you some, really that's about it. There's not really any parameters around this. It's pretty straightforward, just one of those options. And it's just going to go and delete them. And of course, you can put some conditions around that too. All right, send mail. So this one is really important. I think a lot of people would like to use this one, and it is fairly common one in use in the workflows, where you have send out an email based on something happening in the system. So you can give it some name, like notify when item created, because we're doing this on an item created event. Then you have mail templates. So right now we don't have a mail templates created, and simply we go to this plus button, open that up, and we're going to see the mail body here, where you can select any of the placeholders over here on the right-hand side. Give it some name to make it reference. So item is created, send to user. And give it some subject. Your item is created. Here is the ID, whatever you want to put on here. And then you have placeholders that you can put in the subject line and in the body, where you can just take this and say, give me the ID. We could, it could be case ID. We say add that subject, not to body, but add to the subject. We can do the regular ID. Whatever field you want to put in there in the subject, you can also put fields in here in the body. Dear, requester. This could be the requester field if you have a requester field on your item. Say, add the body. Your item has been added to the SharePoint list. Congrats. Things, something like that. And then you can have some metrics about it, like item ID, and grab the ID from here, which is somewhere on here, maybe at the top, I think. Let me do case ID. That's good enough. All right, then you can do other fields on there as well. Create a date if you want to put created. It's a little tricky as it's not an alpha order, but you just kind of search through, and this list has a lot of different items on it. Another thing kind of important to note while we're looking at this mail template is you can actually refer to these lookup lists. So this related assets, this category, issue type, these are actually lookup lists, and what this is doing is pulling in those values from that lookup list. So you could even come in here and pull in a value from a lookup list on your main item into this mail template. So you can get that information and pull it in, kind of a level down from where you are working on the main list. You can go and get that sub list information and actually pull that onto your field or into your template as well. But rather than belabor that, one of the things I want to point out on the bottom here too is also these options for list views. So I mentioned that you could pull in those list views, and this, in a way, list views act very well as reports. I know we have a NITRO report tool as part of NITRO Studio. We'll talk about that in a separate webinar, but this one, in this case here, these list views actually give you a lot of information, a lot of details about what's happening in the site, what's happening in the list. Just you have the filtering, you have other options as to what you show in that view. It really gives you some detail. Could give you a fairly detailed report about, look at overdue tickets. You could look at, overdue items, open items, closed items, things like that can all be added to this, in a list view, and then that can be added onto your template. So you just take it, select it, and say, okay, add that to my template, and add to body. So you can actually have multiple list views in there if you wanted. There's a few options down here for if you're doing an item modified event, you can include updated columns, you can highlight columns, you can insert attachments. Here's where you can insert that report. So we talked about the report option, so you could actually insert the report rather than a view. That's going to be more of a graphical interface versus a view. So you can pull that in and show that in send mail action. And the other thing here, and mostly related to the view and the report placeholder, I think actually really, view and the report placeholder is that you can prevent that email or stop that email from going out if there's nothing to be shown. So if there's no data, there's no report, you can actually stop that from going out, even though the other criteria are met. All the other actions are run, but you can stop that report from going out because it just doesn't have any data. There's no point. In some cases, that's actually good data to have, is that there's no overdue tickets in the given week. All right. And then again, you got that delay execution option. You can choose what type of mail format. HTML is going to be the most common, but you can make it plain text if that makes more sense. Then the to and the from options are the two required fields here for the send mail action. You come in here and you have options for selecting users and groups. So you have these different groups and different users throughout your organization. You have these users in field, so it could be dynamic based on the conditions or based on who's potentially the requester or the assigned staff or your responsible party, whatever field you want to use, you can use that in here. And as long as it's a person or group field where that value is going to have or that person is going to have an email address, you can use that here. Obviously, if they don't have an email address and the system can't resolve who they are, then the mail's not going to go out. And then you could also put in placeholders, email addresses here, where this can go to anyone outside the organization. Gmail accounts, Hotmail accounts, any email address that might exist out there. You can throw that in there. So it's going to be 2, and then the from address is just going to be kind of what is the person seeing? Where is it coming from? Like, where does it look like it's coming from? Kind of an alias in a sense, or it could be a real mailbox, or it could be a no reply or a do not reply mailbox. It could be whatever you need it to be, but it's there for, so when the person hits reply, if it is a mailbox that they can reply to, you can determine where that reply goes to. So then, let's see, we'll move on. So we got the move item. So that's the send mail action. We also have this move item action. So to do this one, I'm actually going to save this one so we can refer back to it if we need to. NITRO Workflows. All right, save that. I'm going to save this in case we need to refer back to it. But the move item one I want to show you, as we already have that predefined and pre-configured in here for the archiving. So we have this archival process as part of the help desk, and we're doing that through the workflow. So you could configure this for any any of your sites. So if any of you are using Nitro and you want to do an archival process, you can kind of copy what we're doing here and use that same process. So this is a scheduled query workflow. So we're going to look at what that scheduled query looks like. And we're also going to look at what that move item, and there's also a query list thing in here. So I'll show you kind of all those, kind of puts it all together in a way for you. So you can see that it's scheduled. It's going to happen every day at hour 5. So it's counting from midnight. So it's going to be 5 a.m. in the local time of the SharePoint server. Or no, not the server. Well, it could be SharePoint server on-prem, or it could be the local time of the regional settings for that SharePoint site. And then what we're doing is we're looking at a CAML query here, and this is kind of a function where we're doing a less than equals to. We're looking at the close date, and we're saying the close date minus 365. So essentially anything that's been closed for over a year, because we're looking at the less than or equal to over a year before the close date. It's going to pick those items. So this is another way to get those items from a list and take some action on them. So we're querying these items and saying, okay, which items in our list meet this criteria? And then when we come down here, there's a query list action here for one of these attendant lists. This is related to our tickets list in our IT site. You may not need it in your use case if you're using it kind of outside that process, but just kind of give you an idea of what this is doing. When this comes up, we'll see what we're working with here as far as where we're pulling this. But it's basically saying, there's this related list of change requests related to the main item. This could be associated tasks for a project, for instance, something like that, where we're getting those sub items, and we're also going to move those. But again, we're in this case, we built a query to do the kind of related ticket ID lookup, which we could actually do the same exact thing that we're doing here with this related items field. I think this was built before we had that related items option, but you can see kind of how it might have been built in the past. But so we're getting that information. We're going to update the ticket ID in the change request list based on that query list variable. So you come in here, you're taking that query list of change request. We're updating the ticket ID. And then we're going to move the items. So this is what this is doing, is taking items from this from the main list of what we, in this case, our tickets list. We're moving them over to what we call this archive tickets list. And what we're doing is, there's associated list mappings, which is not coming up at the moment. Not sure. Yeah, there it is. Okay, good. So we have those associated lists of time tracking, email tickets. So we have all these, in the forms designer, and even outside of that, you can have these associations between one list and another. In the assets database, if you're using that tool of ours, you'll see that there's a lot of links between the assets and associations to tickets and warranties and manuals. So if you ever want to archive those, you just want to make sure you come in here and associate you make sure you grab those associated items as well, so you don't leave them orphaned, right? You don't want to leave those things behind. So in this case, we've created subtasks for project. Let's go back to that scenario where you have a project. You've created a bunch of subtasks, and you want to make sure you archive those off too, so you don't end up with a bunch of subtasks that are orphaned because you've moved that project, but you didn't move the subtask. So this just gives you a way to make sure that if you have those associations, that you also make sure those go across to the archival list as well. And of course, all this is kind of predicated on the fact that you have an archival list to move these to. And my suggestion there is to take a list template of your production list and just create an archive list. Just give it archive projects, archive tickets, archive whatever, and bring it into, just create a new list in your site. And that way you'll have that available for use in this workflow. All right, so that's the move item action. Let me jump out of that. I'm going to take a checkpoint here because it's about 40 minutes in. Do we have any questions or anything that we want to dig into? Scott, is there anything that I should bring up that I might not have mentioned already? All right. Okay, I guess not. So we'll go ahead and move on. All right, we'll keep moving here. I'm going to bring up my demo workflows. Let's give some moment to come back up. Okay, so we talked about these adding, updating, deleting, send mail, move item, query list. There's also this workflow variable option, which I need to get a little more details on myself, so I'll explain that one and maybe in a future webinar. If you have any specific questions on it, certainly reach out and we'll get an answer to you. But I think that essentially the idea is that you can create a variable and take some action on it later in the thing. So kind of like the query list is similar idea where we're capturing information, getting this information, getting an item, getting a collection, and then taking action on it later in the workflow. And the variable is kind of similar concept, but not tied to a specific list or tied to a specific item collection, perhaps. And one of the things that we can do in Workflow Manager that we can't do in custom actions, and this is one of the differences that I want to talk about between these two tools, is have this manage permissions option. The reason we can do this here in the workflow tool is that the workflow tool is running at a higher level of permission within your SharePoint site than the custom actions. And that's one of the key differences. So custom actions, just to show you real quick, there's a lot of the same things in here as there are in the workflow tool, but this is running within the context of the current logged in user, right? So if the current logged in user doesn't have the right to do something, then they're not going to be able to do it. Whereas you might have a workflow that you want to run regardless of what the permission level of the user is. And that workflow needs to be executed to create, unique permissions for an item, for instance. So a lot of times we'll have customers who are using our tool for like a HR system, HR request, something like that, where there's sensitive information, payroll data, perhaps, benefits information, maybe medical information in a healthcare environment. There are definitely a lot of areas where there's, PIH or a HIPAA or some kind of information you want to keep locked down and make sure that no one can see it, that shouldn't be able to see it. This is where the manage permissions action comes in, and this is where you want to run that at the higher level in the workflow tool to make sure that that permission level gets set on that item, regardless of who created it. So, your regular user who's submitting a request, maybe for HR, some kind of HR request, they're not going to have the permission level to set that item level permissions on that item. So that's why we have to have this manage permission action in the workflow to do that for them. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take this action. Again, we can put some conditions around it. We can do it for a current item, lookup item, or again, we can do a query list item where we're breaking inheritance or doing some kind of unique permission level for a whole bunch of items at one time. And then we can take the action type, and you can see there's we try to be fairly descriptive or explicit as possible what we're going to be doing, what's going to happen when you select each of these options. So stop inheriting permissions is basically going to just say you can now set unique permissions on this item. But we actually do that by default with a lot of these other options where you remove user permissions or grant user permissions. Essentially, the grant user permissions option is going to break inheritance by default, and then you can build those permissions back up. So essentially, it's going to say we're going to break inheritance. No one can have access to that item, but we are going to give access back to that item to these particular users or individuals or groups, where you can have a company managers or owners, things like that, and also the requester. So in a lot of cases, you want to make sure the person requesting the information has control over it, and of course, you want to maybe give them edit permission. So they don't have full control over that item. And that's going to be just specific to the item, not to the site or anything beyond the specific item that we're working on for this workflow. This is also an option to, again, you can do it for a whole query list. And then, if we chose that query list option, let me see if we can get that going. Do query list. We do query list title and column name. So using this hash with that query list action, that you're going to see that in a couple different places in the workflows and in the custom actions as well. And that gives you a good way to set things. It's a nice way to set values in items like update items. But anyway, so yeah, so that's the permissions. You can see there's a few different options here for deleting unique, stop inheriting, remove user. Delete unique permissions is just going to re-inherit the permissions essentially. So yeah, you might want to, it's something changes on that item, some criteria changes, and you want to now give access back to everyone else. You can do that. All right, and then a couple other things here we want to dig into before I talk about some custom actions is the invoking a workflow. So invoking a workflow comes from, you could maybe have predefined workflows or ones you've created in the past that you don't want to give up. You don't have to recreate it in this system. That's fine. You can augment them with our tool and say, okay, I want to do this particular action, but then I want to trigger this other workflow that I already built, months ago or years ago, and I don't want to bother recreating it in the system. That's fine. So you can choose the workflows, and you've got the SharePoint workflows, which we don't have any here, so that's why this is blank. And also the same with Microsoft Flow. I don't think we have. We actually would reference the URL for the Microsoft Flow, which I know is Microsoft Power Automate now. It's not Microsoft Flow. It's Power Automate. We got to update our system. I understand. But the idea here is that you can invoke that workflow and run it on a current item, lookup item, or a query list item within the tool. So we could say, okay, now we've got our items from the query list workflow. Let's go ahead and do this Microsoft Flow that we've created, whatever that might be, whatever you want to do with it. You can do that from here. This is the same with the SharePoint workflow. And then the other thing here is this invoking of a web service. So this is really where it can expand far beyond what you would normally do maybe on a typical business operation. Let's say you want to get information from a different database, and that database doesn't have to be within the Microsoft space. It could be Dropbox, it could be Salesforce, it could be any other system that's out there, if you want to bring in or you pull in data or export data, send data to a different source, this is where you do it. So you have this web service option. Give it some name. We have a URL that you can put in here. Actually, we have this in our workflow, not only in the workflows, but also in custom actions. And I'll show you what I developed in custom actions to kind of show you how this all works. Essentially, any service that has a REST API, REST, all capital letters, API, any service that has those REST APIs, you can go and take action on it. Now, any of those services out there, and you'll see that I pulled up what we did for Dropbox over here. They have a lot of details, a lot of information already out there. This is all coming from the Dropbox site as an example. This is you could probably find this on QuickBooks. You could probably find this on Salesforce or any system, any service that has some kind of API associated with it should have documentation like this available to you. And so you can use this documentation, you can use this information and expand out beyond your SharePoint site and say, okay, I want to go, like in this example, what I did is I created a folder. I actually did it as a button in a custom action from the contracts list. But the idea is that you have this folder, or you want to go and create a folder. So the kind of use case here, let's go back up for a second, is that we have a contract here. And I called it REST API demo for webinar just to make it explicit what I was doing with it. But essentially, you have a contract or whatever it is. It could be any SharePoint list item. You want to go take some action. So here's one of the other key differences between a custom action and workflow is that you can press the button and it'll do something versus waiting for an item to get created or an item to be modified or a scheduled query. The custom action is going to invoke it. But again, like I said, it's going to be happening from the context of the current logged in user. So there might be some limitations there you want to be aware of. But essentially, what I did is I created this web service, invoked a web service to create a folder in Dropbox. So I'll go ahead and walk through what we did here to set that up. So I created my action, which could also be a workflow, either way. So you can set some conditions around it. And then you have this option to execute on the client side, or you could do it from the server side. And the server side is going to be out in, we have a subscription in Microsoft Azure, mainly in the Office 365 space. And on-prem, this would be running in your on-prem server, so you don't have to worry about that piece of it. But you could run it from the context of the client or context of the server. And then you get the URL, which the URL is coming from, again, it's coming from the documentation that you find for that service. So, you have this create folder URL, pop that in there. You have your HTTP method, which could be post, get, put, whatever. That information should be on here as well. It should be like a post. You see, it's a post method. And then you create your headers. So again, coming back to our documentation, you'll see that there's headers here for. There's an authorization header, but we have an authorization section. And then there's content type, which is another header, which we need to explicitly define in our action. So we go and so if I click on new, you'll see that we give a key and a value. So the key and the value is basically what we get from the documentation. So the key is going to be content type and the value is going to be application JSON. So we get that information, add it to our header. Then we have our authentication type, which we're again pulling from our documentation. You can see it's bearer token. We can get it, before all this, I had to create an app in Dropbox to do this, and it gave me a special app token, which was this long string of text here. So I just took that, put it into Notepad, so I could reference it later. And then, come in here, write the word bearer, give it a space, and then add in my string there. And then there's the data. And the great thing about the data here is that, the documentation is showing you just a few, it's going to just create this folder called homework math, just a straight up document, that's what it's going to be called. But in our tool, we can actually use these placeholders. So title in between these percentages, this is the placeholder. And that's going to be the title of the item that we're working on. So if you come back over here, you see that we have this REST API demo for webinar title. And that's what is going to be added as a folder to our Dropbox account. In this case, we're not using it in the variable mapping, so we'll skip that piece of it. But this is gives you a way to have that placeholder to create that value. And you'll see I also set auto rename as false, and you'll see why in just a moment. So if you take this process, we hit this button, you're going to create the folder. This is going to give me an error because I didn't want to rename it because I already created that. All right, if I go into my Dropbox folder, you'll see there's a bunch of stuff in here. Let's see, this is my Dropbox folder. Just kind of did this as an example. There's a test API upload. And you'll see I already did two of these. If when I set that as true, let's go back here and set this as true. Save that. All right, I'm going to close that. Run it again. This time it works. And if I go to, I don't know if I still have Dropbox open. I do. Okay, Dropbox open over here. You'll see if I go into my test API upload folder, it's got, now I added a third one here. So it did that renaming. But anyway, I mean, really the idea is that you can come in and play around with the settings and use the documentation available to you from those other resources to create that web service and invoke that web service and really expand out what you can do with workflows and what you can do with custom actions extensively. So it's kind of our answer to what Microsoft is doing with the premium connectors in Power Automate, where you're going to have to pay a whole bunch of money for those now. But this gives you a way to work around that and kind of circumvent that process. So where previously you might have had to use a premium connector in Flow, you can go look at that same service and get the API information and use the invoke web service action from within our tool, either through custom actions or workflows, and get the same results. Okay, so that's the workflow. I think the extent of what we can do with the workflows, I mean, we can, I think that pretty much covers most of it. Any questions out there that we should address?
Hello. Yes. No, I addressed them. There were a couple, but I addressed them. But yeah, you raised a lot of really good information on the workflows and custom actions, and it's even from my perspective, it's a very, very powerful tool. Yeah, I know I'm in on it, but even when you show it with all its details, it's incredibly powerful and useful, and hopefully people will find great uses for it and contact for any questions or concerns about how you do this or how you do that. Really pretty amazing capabilities.
But yeah, I think so too. I mean, we can. There's a lot. There's definitely a lot there that we didn't really touch on the custom action so much because I think we're getting a little bit long in the tooth for this webinar. So we could definitely dig into that and maybe a different one where we talk about custom actions. Again, just to recap real quick, custom actions are kind of on click, on button click, you can do something, and the workflow tool is looking more for the something to happen. It's kind of a passive trigger where it's looking for one of these events to occur versus a custom action where you're actually creating the button on form and could create it up here at the top. You could create it in the context of your form as well, and that could be a useful process. Yeah, so I won't belabor the custom actions because I know we're getting a little late here, but
yeah, I'll have to have another workshop just for that. But it's amazing of a lot in Nitro. But yeah, you are getting the top of the hour, so it might be good to to close up and hold. Well, we do hold these workshops every month. It should be one at the end of January, February, every month, sort of towards the third week or so. We don't have it listed on the webinars page yet, but just setting up for the 2020 schedule. We do have a webinar. Actually, that's January 16th now. We just changed that, so we have to update the website. That's a webinar on replacing InfoPath forms for Crow Canyon's NITRO Studio. It'll be on January 16th. Got to update that. But yes, basically stay tuned. And thanks, James. You can finish up if whatever comments you want. But thanks for a great show of the workflow processes and etc.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do it. It's a great tool. I love it. I think I'm enthusiastic about it. I hope that came across. So January 16th. make that 6 in your mind. It's going to be the replace InfoPath forms with Crocana's NITRO Studio. So get a little more detail about the forms tool and how you can use that to replace InfoPath. And then just keep an eye on this website. We'll be populating it with new workshops, with new webinars throughout the year. We
Yeah,
do
we're
about
also
one a month.
email. We send
Yeah,
out
yeah,
emails regularly, and
exactly.
happy holidays to everyone, right?
Yeah,
Thanks
yeah.
again.
Thanks everyone for joining, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and enjoy the rest of the year. And take care. Thank you.
Thank you.